Hi, I'm Patrick Vernon. I'm director of Every Generation Media, social enterprise. I set up 16 years ago to promote Black history and culture in the UK. I'm also a social commentator, so I write articles and blogs on issues to do with Black identity, heritage, history, mental well-being. Also, I'm a campaigner and political activist, so I've been elected representative as a politician, and also I've been involved in a number of campaigns. More recently, I've been heavily involved over the last 12 months or so around the WINDRUSH Scandal in the UK, where people of the Windrush generation were declassified as British by the British government, and then they lost their jobs, lost access to healthcare, and luckily I launched a petition working with others to force the government to apologise and to make good by recognising, by giving compensation to those people who've been affected.
Okay, well, we're going to get into some of that. It sounds a bit like Malcolm X in London. What's that been like, though? Choosing this path. You're talking about Black identity.
Yeah.
You're in the midst of the United Kingdom.
Yes.
Talk to me about that journey.
Yes. Well, I mean, the journey starts with my parents. They were part of that Windrush generation. They came to Britain in the late 50s, like other people that came from Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Grenada, to start a new life. And they raised myself and my 4 sisters. Now, 60 years on, they've been in Britain, actually a bit more than that. There are about 3.5 generations of us living in Britain, which is no different to lots of Caribbean families. I'm sure everyone in Barbados have got family members living in Britain or America or Canada, and they can identify with that migration journey of achievement, and also and keeping the connection with the country as well. So my parents have always had that close connection with Jamaica, and that's why I've got kind of close connection myself, because I've travelled there, got to know my family there, and I'm very proud of that, of the roots and connections there.
Okay, about your calling personally, about the work that you've done, social work, community work, healthcare, and so on.
Yeah.
Specifically, in terms when you're talking about Black history, promoting Black history to young kids, to families, and so on.
Yeah.
I want to know what inspired you to go that route, to invest your time, your energy,
Sure.
Your resources into promoting Black history.
Yeah, I think for most of us of my generation who were born in Britain in the 60s and 70s, we didn't learn anything at all at school or at university about Black history. So really, after I went to university, I went to study law. I started to go from my own journey of self-discovery, reading books from Black writers, academics, and then later on travelling to the Caribbean but doing lots of travelling in Africa, and almost creating my own perspective and learning about Black history, reading books, going to courses, talk to people, and in many ways that's given me the kind of self-awareness and foundation to help me in my work that I do in health and social care, the work I do around research and writing and advocates for Black history, and more importantly it's given me the understanding of our historical context, and that's why I recognised the whole issue around the WINDRUSH Scandal, because it was part of our history that was being taken away from us. So it's been a journey of self-discovery and learning and investing in time to do that.
Okay. I know our viewers, they really want to get an update on what's happening with the WINDRUSH Scandal and so on. You've done a lot of activism surrounding that, defending, I know, a lot of families who've been deported,
Yes.
people who've had their lives, pretty much uprooted.
Yes.
So before we get to that, there's something that you did a few years ago that I think is relatively important, which I think should precede our conversation about the WINDRUSH Scandal, and that's about the contribution of Black Britons.
Yes.
You did a piece of work, I suppose, in reply, some say,
Yes.
to what the BBC would have done.
Yes.
And your work got, I think, it's amazing the way that it was received.
Yes.
As though it was much more needed.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I wanted to talk to me about that project specifically.
Yeah.
Before we get into the WINDRUSH situation.
Sure. So I launched a campaign actually some time ago now, but back in 2003. So we're going back about a good 15, 16 years ago, called 100 Great Black Britons. Yes, and it was in response to the BBC. The BBC launched a major TV poster campaign looking for the greatest Briton of all time. So the BBC spent a lot of money and resources to get the public in Britain to choose and vote for the greatest Britain of all time. So the BBC pulled together a list of 100 Great Britons, and the public voted on that, and the public voted for Winston Churchill, the World War II leader of Britain at that time, as the greatest Britain of all time. At the time when the BBC announced the results, actually people initially said, "Oh, that's good," but actually quite a few people said, "Well, this campaign was misleading because a lot of people from Wales complained there weren't enough Welsh people. A lot of Scottish people complained there weren't enough Scottish people, and a lot of feminists said, well, there weren't enough women on the list." And then from a black perspective, there was no black person at all on the list, and actually the only person of any ethnic background was Freddie Mercury, lead singer for the band Queen, who was born in Zanzibar in East Africa of Persian parents. So he was the nearest person of colour that was on that list. So I decided, well, there's been a black presence in Britain for a long time, and unfortunately the BBC have reinforced the perception that we don't exist, we don't have a history, and we're completely invisible. So I decided to do a counter-campaign called the 100 Great Black Britons, to demonstrate to the black community, but also to Britain, that we have been here over 1,000 years and we're contributing. So my list, which was like based on the website, so this is for the days of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So the web was still a bit clunky all that time, but I launched the website and with the team, and on our website we had over 100 people going far back as Septimus Severus, who rebuilt Adrian's Wall around about AD 200. Unfortunately, the nearest person in Britain that we've ever had to a black prime minister, because he was a Roman emperor in charge of Britain at the time, to covering politicians, sports athletes, business people, writers, political thinkers, activists, as well. So it was quite an extensive list, which was very well received. So much so that within 24 hours of launching the website, it crashed, because I think we had millions and millions of hits on the website because people were just hunger for the information as well as voting. The eventual winner of my campaign lasted for 3 months, and the public voted for Mary Seacole, who was a Crimean. It was a woman of colour who served in the Crimean War during the Victorian era, at the same time as Florence Nightingale. Actually, there were kind of peers, but Florence Nightingale didn't really acknowledge Mary Seacole. But Mary Seacole set up the British Hotel on the battlegrounds in Balaclava in Turkey, where she nursed, as well as selling some alcohol. But she nursed, and she was called. The soldiers called her Mother Seacole. She came after the war was over. She was recognised in British society, but soon after she died, her history had disappeared. And even though there have been various books written about her, people didn't know much about her. But the public voted for her, and the result of her being voted the greatest black Briton of all time, a number of things happened. She was on the Royal Mint, printed some coins recognising her. There were a number of TV programmes made about her life. For the first time ever, she was actually quoted and referred to in the national curriculum for all schools in England, in Britain. And then there was a campaign organised by a peer and some nurses who raised £500,000 for a statue which was unveiled about 3 or 4 years ago in the grounds of a hospital in central London, overlooking, and the grounds of the hospital is actually by the Thames, not far from the Parliament. So that was I believe that was all linked to the campaign that I was involved in. I'm planning to relaunch the campaign again this year, because I've said before, it was some time ago I did this. There are new heroes and sheroes that historians and writers have found that come out of the historical woodwork. There's new kind of role models in the community over the last 15-16 years as well. So I'll be launching this campaign later on this summer. People will vote again for the Greatest Black Briton, and the results will be announced in around January, February in 2020.
Okay, so part of the importance of what you place in your work is, black identity,
Yeah,
black history, and so on.
yeah.
What have you found in terms of receptivity? 2019, you're talking about 16, 15 years after this body of work.
Yeah,
It was received well back then.
yeah.
What do you anticipate? What are you seeing right now?
Well, I mean, since then, to be quite that it's. I mean, I'm not the only person that's been doing this for a number of years. There've been writers, historians, academics, campaigners, teachers, and collectively, everyone's worked to make sure that there's more black history in the curriculum. There should be more. There's more resources out there, and there's more of awareness. We celebrate every year in the UK Black History Month. That takes place in October. I know it takes place in the Caribbean and America in February, but we celebrate it in October, and so it's gone in ebbs and flows. But I think over the last few years there's been a more great emphasis in promoting Black History Month throughout October, and actually beyond October, throughout the autumn and spring as well. So and I think the reason why I'm interested in this area of black history and identity, not obviously we need to know our history, we need to know our achievements, because I think we can learn from the past to move forward, but also I think it's linked to our identity. And I've worked for many years in the field of health and social care, particularly around mental health, and I think if you don't have a sense of your history, it has an impact on your identity, it has an impact on your self-esteem, it has an impact on your self-confidence. So when someone challenges you and say, we think that you don't have a history, or we don't think that you've contributed, or we think that you've done nothing at all and you're just taking up too much space, we can challenge them and say, we've had great empires going back from Kemet to the Musa, who was the ruler of Mali in the 14th century, one of the richest men in the world. We've contributed not only through our lives, through the history of enslavement, but we've actually created our own resistance, fighting for emancipation. All these histories are really important to us, but if you are told that you have no history, then it means that it makes you question who you are. And I think personally that's one of the reasons, along with other factors, why I think there are so many of us in Britain who are now stuck in the mental health system. There is a massive overrepresentation of black men and increasingly black women in mental health institutions, because the way that we were taught in school, the way that society and the media communicates overt as well as subliminal messages about black identity is negative. And you'll have to work really hard to create something positive about yourself and about your history. And one of the reasons why I'm here in Jamaica and Barbados through the Winston Churchill, I've got Winston Churchill Travel Award, is a lessons can we learn from the Caribbean experience of history, of heritage, of arts and culture that can be used in a therapeutic setting to help people around issues around self-esteem and mental well-being.
Okay, so that's an interesting subject matter, because oftentimes when it comes to when we're talking about the health of black people and different things and the type of food that we should consume,
Yes.
the type of health care
Yes.
that would work better and respond better with our DNA, some people figure, well, look, it doesn't really work. Traditional medicine is not always applicable sometimes to us. So in terms of what you're studying, your line of research, give me an idea. Is it just a simple case of I'm stressed out, I go home, I put in my favorite CD, Bob Marley, and just relax? Is there a way to measure that? Is there a way to say, well, look, the music or the motion of me painting or doing some outdoor plein air workshop for weekend and relaxing? Is there a way to measure that?
There is been over the last 10-15 years there's been increasing research work done in the UK as well as in America and places like Australia, where they've looked at creativity in the arts, so singing, dancing, creative writing, photography, filmmaking, learning about history, going to art galleries. There's been a body of work to say that if you develop a package or range of courses or arts intervention alongside support, maybe counselling support, with people with high levels of anxiety or depression, that could save money, i.e. in the sense that you don't need to have so much medication, and also it's about people's self-control and self-identity by having an arts-based therapeutic intervention. The question I want to find out is, does black history, black culture, the black art creates that not that cost saving, but does that create that intervention that could make a difference in people's well-being and lives? And the problem that we have, which is kind of reinforced, which is the wider context of the black experience, is that experience has not been researched, documented or evaluated, and often that experience is not even valued, and sometimes we don't even value that experience ourselves. We don't even value the creativity that we have. So one of the things I've been doing, I've been talking to psychiatrists, researchers in Jamaica and also here in Barbados to work out how can we develop a perspective from a black-led perspective, a Caribbean perspective, on how do we quantify this, and how can we develop services that could have a more therapeutic intervention using black culture and black art. So to me, this is the start of a journey that I hope to work with other people in the Caribbean, in America, and particularly in the UK, to develop our own agency and our own intellectual thinking, because the traditional models of which is often a very European, Eurocentric model, is not working for us. It's simply not working for us. What's quite clear that the models of mental health services that's been delivered in the Caribbean is very similar to the UK, because obviously Britain has influence because of empire and colonisation, and America as well, and everyone's using the European model around services and delivery, which is fine to a certain extent. And I was hoping that maybe that I could find more about a Caribbean persona or perspective to say, right, okay, well, how can we make our own cultural lived experiences that make a difference? And I've come across the work of Dr. Fred Hicklin in Jamaica, who's a psychiatrist by training, an academic, who was the medical director in the 70s of Bellevue, which was one of the last, which is closed down now, which was like a massive mental health asylum institute in Jamaica, and he started to develop art therapy back in the 70s, and today he's now training a new generation of social workers, psychologists, therapists to incorporate arts in their clinical practice. I've met people here in Barbados who are doing something similar, but working in the school context of providing training for teachers who can then deliver black history, self-esteem, awareness raising for children in schools in Barbados. So I think there are lots of examples where people are doing great work, but the question is, how can we create a critical mass so it has an impact not just on people who are in maybe experiencing high degrees of depression or anxiety, but how do we use that in everyday life? And you're quite right. Yes, of course we listen to music when you might get a bad day at work or whatever, and you listen to music, or you go to the theatre or comedy. So we do that already, but I think in those instances where people are in a hospitalised situation, we could do more of that work.
Okay. Now, I know viewers are waiting, they're eager to get an update from you because you've been so active in terms of, advocating for the rights of those people who would have been disadvantaged as part of the WINDRUSH Scandal. Now, for those who have no idea what WINDRUSH is, I want you to give me a full update. First of all, explain what the WINDRUSH generation is in terms of that movement.
Yes.
You mentioned it earlier,
Yes.
but it's important to the diaspora.
Yeah.
Even for those who don't know, a lot of our families and those deep connections are really rooted in this early movement. So start by giving me that, and then you can take me into explaining what the full scandal is and what's happening currently in England.
Yeah. So after the Second World War, Britain had a massive labour shortage. Parts of Britain were heavily bombed by the Germans, and Britain realised that if Britain was going to reconstruct its economy again, it needed labour. So, but initially they were hoping that people from Australia, New Zealand and Canada would come back to Britain to help in that reconstruction process, but that never happened. So they realised, who else can they go to? they came to the Caribbean, and then later on went to India and other places, former colonies of part of the British Empire. And under the 1948 British Nationality Act, anyone who came from the Caribbean or any part of the colonies, if they came to Britain, they would be automatically seen as British citizens. They could work. They didn't need to get a work permit or anything. They could work. They could register to vote. They could play a full active life, no different to the indigenous white population of Britain. So from 1948, that's what happened. So obviously people see symbolically the Empire Windrush ship that left the Caribbean in May, arrived in Britain in June in 1948 as the start of that mass migration. And as you know, in terms of Caribbean history, there has always been mass migration. People went to the Panama Canal, that was mass migration. People went to America, particularly from 1900s up to the Second World War in mass migration, and Canada in mass migration. So the Caribbean is its biggest export is people. You know, that's the biggest export. So that is no different to the historiography of migration from the Caribbean. So the Windrush generation, I mean, the word Windrush has only been used only in the last few years. So it's still quite a new terminology that people have used and trying to get their head around. But it describes a movement of people from basically post-Second World War right up to the 1970s, and as well from the Caribbean. But also there were Africans who were part of that generation coming from Ghana, Nigeria, as well, because they were invited. They came to Britain also to contribute, and people came to Britain for a whole variety of reasons. People came because some of them had already served in the Second World War. So a lot of the passengers that were on the Empire Windrush ship actually had served in the RAF during the Second World War, so they wanted to go back to Britain because they enjoyed being in Britain and wanted. And also there was mass poverty and unemployment during that period, so people had no choice but to leave as well. And also people heard lots of stories about, if we come to Britain, I can make my money, I can go to Britain for 5 years, 10 years, make loads of money, and then come back. That was the 5-year plan, 10-year plan. So there was a whole variety of people. People came to Britain to develop their careers or to enhance their careers as doctors, teachers and nurses, engineers, etc. And so that's what happened. There was a mass migration, and in many ways it was a brain drain. The youngest, the most talented left the Caribbean to Britain, but unfortunately when they got to Britain they realised they weren't really invited, because at the time it was the expression that was used called a colour bar, which meant that there was discrimination in terms of getting jobs, and if you did get a job you'd be paid at a lesser rate compared to white people. You were discriminated in getting housing, either poor substandard housing, and you were discriminated in the streets. So if you went out to party, people didn't want you in their pubs. So we had to create our own house parties, and that had an impact. And then eventually sound systems came, and we created our own kind of infrastructure around black music, from ska, reggae, to calypso, soca. We brought that music from the Caribbean as well. So that's a generation, but they all worked in key industries. A lot of them worked for the National Health Service as nurses and ancillary staff. A lot of them worked in manufacturing, transport. A lot of them worked in public services. And in many ways, I think the Caribbean, that generation, it happened to be my parents' generation, made a significant contribution in helping Britain in time of need and difficulty. But sadly, over the last 50, 60 years, people have not really valued or recognised that contribution. And then what's interesting is, I think we gave the impression to people in Jamaica and Barbados that everyone gave the impression that everyone was doing really well. So they'll send the barrels, the remittances, and gave the impression, of course, we're doing very well. But actually, it was a kind of a mirage of they were hiding the discrimination and the expectation they were hoping to have as well. But despite that, they raised families. The growth of black churches in Britain, everything that you could think of, we influenced all aspects of British society. Any aspect of British society, we were there, we influenced. Didn't get the recognition though, but we influenced, So I think that generation is quite important in the historiography of post-war Britain. And also that led to the big issues later on, to the WINDRUSH Scandal, when the public realised that this contribution was part of Britain and people felt that they were let down, and the British government let them down when the government decided to take away people's citizenship and rights.
Okay, so you've brought me from a place where, black people have contributed. You've explained that scenario. Fast forward, give me an idea as to what has happened since then. Where are we now? 2019, 2018, last year, 2017.
In terms of the WINDRUSH Scandal,
yeah. What went wrong?
So what happened was, over the last, to be honest, over the last 30, 40 years, there has been an erosion, or what I should say, there's been a toughening of immigration controls. And I have to say, it's been racist. It's been targeted towards the Caribbean people, African people from India as well. Whereas if you're coming from different parts of the Dominions, i.e. Australia, New Zealand, you don't have that same degree of discrimination in terms of coming to Britain, getting your status, and etc. Over the last 10, 15 years, as you know, you need to get visas to come to Britain. And ironically, we were the ones that, during the Second World War, we helped, over 16,000 men and women from the Caribbean serve in the Second World War. We even raised money, the equivalent of we raised about £2 million of fundraising across all the Caribbean islands for the war effort. Yet people felt that, why is it that it seemed to not reflect our contribution as well? So I think over the last 40 years there's been a tightening of different immigration laws, making it difficult. And the 1971 Immigration Act really, in many ways, played a key role in really reducing the number of people coming from the Caribbean in significant numbers. And that's where the WINDRUSH generation period really slowed down significantly in many ways. So what happened in 2014, that Theresa May, who was then the Home Secretary, now the Prime Minister, decided that in response to public opinion, that they should even have tougher controls around immigration, reduce the number of black and brown people coming to Britain. And she introduced a concept called the hostile environment, which meant that if you wanted to get a job, open a bank account, get a driver's license, anything at all, you had to prove that you were British. You had to have some paperwork to prove that you're British. And during this period, I talked about the WINDRUSH generation that came to Britain from 1948 to the 70s. Parents, the WINDRUSH generation, men and women in their 30s and 40s and 20s, came over. Some of them brought their children, like the ones who were left behind. They were being looked after by their grandparents and other family members. And then when people had enough money, they'd come and fetch and bring those children. But they didn't need to have individual passports, these children, because they were, as long as the parents were with them, they were still British. They were undocumented, but they were British. By the time we reached 2014, those children who are now in their 50s, 60s and 70s, especially those who never travelled, all of a sudden faced the difficulty. They had no paperwork to prove they were British, even though they were British. And so you had lots of situations whereby someone would be contacted by their boss and say, where's your paperwork to prove that you're British? Even though they might be working for that same employer for years. And they say, I don't have the paperwork. Well, you can't, we have to let you go. So lots of people lost their jobs, people couldn't access healthcare, people who had paid into their pensions couldn't access the pensions because they had no paperwork to prove they were British. And so this had a massive impact over the last 3-4 years. People then were being deported back to the Caribbean because they had no paperwork. People received letters from the Home Office to say that you've been an overstayer for 20-30 years. And then the onus was on you to prove that you were British. And the only way you could prove that you were British if you had 4 pieces of paperwork or evidence that you were British, which meant that if you've been in Britain for about 40-50 years and you came over as a child, who has paperwork every year 4 pieces of evidence for the last 40, 50 years. I think for the average person in the UK, and it might be the same in Barbados, you might go far back as 3, 4 years in terms of wage slips, paperwork. Can you go back 30, 40 years and get evidence every single year that you've been in the country? So the way it was designed, it was done in such a way, knowing full well that people wouldn't have that evidence, which means that they'll be deported. That's what happened. People got deported, or if people were on holiday and all of a sudden they found that they couldn't come back in the country. So obviously this had a major impact. So I got involved in the campaign and played a key role in the campaign because I issued a petition against the government, and it's an online petition which anyone can do, any British citizen can do, and I was able to generate over 200,000 signatures of support, but there were other stuff was happening as well. The Commonwealth Heads meeting was taking place in London, and a number of the Caribbean High Commissioners and Guy Hewitt, who was a former ambassador in the UK, played a key role in getting all the various High Commission 15 countries of the Caribbean coming together to say to the British government, we feel that you're treating Caribbean people unfairly and harshly. And that was another key factor in putting pressure on the government. And also there were lots of campaign groups raising issues. So between my petition, what was happening with the Caribbean governments raising their concerns, and other people as well, and the media and journalists writing articles and profiling, and more important, the voices of those people, those victims, telling their stories, that put so much pressure on the government that the government had to apologise and do a U-turn. So where we are now, 12 months on, because we are now approaching the first anniversary of the scandal, a number of people have been fast-tracked. Over 3,000 people have now got their paperwork and now are British and can travel freely to the Caribbean without worrying about being deported. But there's still a backlog. There's still more people that paperwork needs to be processed.
And some have been compensated as well.
And then, as we speak, the government will be announcing very shortly the compensation scheme. Because one of the key things that was quite clear was the injustice. People were living in poverty. Some people were made homeless. People lost their homes, their jobs, and people even died. So 2 people died in the UK, and about 9 people died in the Caribbean because of being in destitution, poverty, and the impact on your physiology. Just imagine that you are told that you're going to be deported to a place that you only went once when you were a child. You're not going to see your loved ones. It has an impact on your mental well-being and your physical health. And 2 people in the UK died. One died of hypertension and one died of a stroke. You can't imagine the stress that you're carrying to fight for your survival. And that's what happens to a lot of people. And a lot of people have been traumatised. Not only they've been traumatised, their children and grandchildren have been traumatised because their parents or grandparents, they might not see them again. So that's why the government has now recognised this, and they'll be announcing a compensation scheme. And I really, really hope that the government gives a fair, proper scheme, so all the losses that people have incurred, and some of those losses you can never put a value. What happened? What value could you put on missing a funeral of your parents because you weren't allowed to travel? What value do you put on losing 8-9 years worth of income and all the things, and losing your home? That can never. I mean, the compensation financially can help to a certain extent, but not completely. So I hope the government will give the right compensation scheme as well. And the final thing is the deportation flights. So the government did suspend for 9 months deportation flights while they were doing an internal review of their systems. But unfortunately, the government did not wait for the final report, which is going to come out in April, regarding it's called Lessons Learned Review, and they started doing deportation flights again, initially to Jamaica, and that led to a big outcry. People were very critical of this, and also some of the people that were on that flight didn't need to be on that flight, and people were also very critical of the Jamaican government, because before anyone's deported to any country, the country who they're going to have to sign the form so they can get the clearance to be deported. So people weren't happy. So I think that the government have now there's a lot of pressure on the government on these deportation flights, and also a lot of people are actually saying, well, actually this is against people's human rights, because one of the reasons why they're deporting people who have been in Britain for 20, 30 years. They may not have fitted into the classic definition of the WINDRUSH generation, because these are people in their 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s. But most of them have spent at least 20 plus years in Britain. Just imagine you left Barbados as a child, about as a 5-year-old. You've been in Britain for about 30, 40 years. You might have got caught up in some, criminal stuff. Nothing heavy. You've served your time. You've now turned your life around. You've got family. You've got children. You're working. And all of a sudden you get a letter from the Home Office to say, because you were born in Barbados, we don't think you're British, we're going to deport you. And that's why a lot of people feel very angry about these deportation flights.
I want you now to just, this is possibly your final comment, but what I want you to do for me is, you mentioned how some of these families have been torn apart.
Yes.
You may have some person right now who may watch this interview, who may have a relative and they're concerned about that relative. They're hearing the Caribbean, they're hearing the misinformation, they're hearing the information, they have their ideas about what's happening. As some person on the front line out there fighting and trying to get justice for some of these people, what do you say to some of the relatives back here in the Caribbean, Barbados, Jamaica, that you can put them at ease when they're thinking about the family members in the UK?
So I think family is important. I mean, it's just, if they, one of the key issues has been that when people found out that they were threatened by potential deportation or losing their rights here, some people didn't even tell family members. As you know, we are very proud people, aren't we? And sometimes we keep stuff to ourselves. So, so that's one of the issues which I think some of the victims have acknowledged, that maybe they should have showed this information much earlier. But I think what we can do, there are some practical things that we can do. So the government will be launching very shortly the compensation scheme. There might be people living in Barbados, in Jamaica and other Caribbean islands who might be entitled to claim for the compensation scheme. So I would recommend them to contact the UK the High Commission office, the UK High Commission office, for more information. There'll be certain information that will be on various websites, but I think they should contact the High Commission's office. I know there will be plans to organise some road shows and promotional events to let people know. Secondly, as I said before, a number of people have been deported back to the Caribbean, and one of the key things I learned in Jamaica is there was a massive stigma of deportees, and I think it's important that people locally in the communities in Barbados and Jamaica have welcome them, because most of these people didn't want to come back to the Caribbean. They've been forced by the British government to come back to the Caribbean. They have left their livelihoods, they've left their families, and they have to start a new life again. They can't go back to Britain. They can't be reunited with their family. Okay, the families might come over and see them on holiday, but that's not the same thing, is it? It's not the same thing. You could do a Skype call, but that's not the same thing. So I think Caribbean communities need to have them welcomed with open arms and not to stigmatise them, because they want, because all of them have talent and skills which will benefit the country. I think also there are a lot of people in the UK who have not come forward yet. A lot of people are afraid, because they believe that if they contact the Home Office and say, I want to sort out my status, they feel that they might even be on those flights themselves. But I think it's important for those individuals to get independent legal advice, so they can sort out their citizenship. Otherwise, they will be living in the shadows for years by not coming forward and to sort out their status. One of the things that I've done, I've worked with a charity in the UK called Joint Council for Welfare for Immigrants. We launched a campaign called the WINDRUSH Justice Fund. We've raised money and we're going to give out small grants to community groups, so the community groups can do the outreach work to convince people to come forward to sort out their paperwork as well. So that's some of the practical things that I think people can consider.
Okay, finally, I won't keep you much longer. What I want you to do for me now is to give us all your handles for social media, your website.
Sure.
Tell us about this game as well. Just tell us about what you're doing personally outside of some of the community work that you're doing? What
Yeah.
are you doing personally? What can we expect from
Yeah.
Patrick Vernon?
So obviously, I've been heavily involved with WINDRUSH Scandal, but my passion is issues around mental health, well-being, and Black history. So one of the things I'll be doing after my trip to the Caribbean is to share my findings. I've been writing some articles and blogs. I want to start a dialogue about the importance of arts and culture in in terms of improving our self-esteem around mental health well-being. So I'm happy to work with people to find examples of good practice out there. I've launched a board game called the WINDRUSH game. For many years I've done a lot of research work around my own family history, so I've traced my roots from UK to Jamaica to Senegal, and I think that it's important around our whole self and identity to learn more about family history, our own histories in the Caribbean and Africa. So I've developed this board game to help people to play, to reminisce, share stories. We don't share enough stories like we used to. We're in a social media world where we spend all our time on gadgets and on phones, but we don't spend enough time to have family interaction. So that's why I've designed the game. I'm relaunching my campaign 100 Great Black Britons to celebrate again the history of Black British contributions to the UK. And I'll be writing articles and I'll still be campaigning on these issues. If you want to get hold of me, my main website is the windrushgame.co.uk, or I've got my personal website is www.patrickvernon.org.uk. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, so it's my initials PP Vernon or Patrick Vernon, on Facebook as well, Instagram as well. So I'm out there doing my stuff, and I think social media is quite important. I know that social media has a negative side because there's been an increase in xenophobia, hate crime, and abuse targeting particularly Black women in Britain, and as well as Black people generally. But I think that there are positive sides around social media because it's a good way to communicate across the world. Your program, you'll use your social media platforms to let people know about your show, which I think is really important. So and it's also about communicating